Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Russell Guay. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Management and David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics. Welcome to the Faculty and Staff Ethics interview series. Our guest today is Drew Kahler. Drew is an adjunct faculty instructor in marketing and sales for the past year. He's also director of sales for Channel Fusion for 4 years now, former account executive at BGM also. His undergrad degree is in marketing from UNI and recently completed his MBA from the University of Iowa. Also pretty heavily involved in some volunteer experiences throughout the Cedar Valley. And I think we're going to mostly talk today about ethics in his sales background, although we might segue a little bit away from that too at times. We'll see. But Drew, thank you for doing this. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, appreciate it having me. Thanks, Rusty.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start off with the sales background, whether that's the year you've spent in the classroom and in front of students, or whether it's primarily talking about your career in sales. I'm sure there's several ethical issues that you've had to contend with at times, or ethical dilemmas and things that you share with your students along the way. So let's kind of start with some of those areas.
Yeah, fortunately, I haven't had to personally get into a lot of ethical binds myself, but
Good.
just being in and around the spaces, I've seen a lot of different things. A lot of ethical items with sales really comes to two main areas, and that comes with usually money. Is it expense reports? Is it commission reporting? Who gets a deal? So on and so forth. We'll start with the expense reports. This actually happened quite a bit in a former life of mine where, I'm sure your background in HR, you probably have seen a lot of this where, people go to conferences.
Yes, you're correct.
Yeah, people go to conferences, right? And yep. I don't know, I've always approached it as if I wouldn't spend my money on it, I'm not going to spend my company's money on it.
Good.
But I don't think that's prevalent. I think it's all like, oh, I'm not paying for this. Let's get the most expensive thing on the menu at the most expensive restaurant in the area.
Yeah.
And that's not illegal, and it's not even necessarily against company policy unless company policy dictates a per diem or something like that. And not every company that has staff that go to these kind of things has a sophisticated enough policy to cover that. But
right. That's true.
Realistically, all you're really doing is hurting yourself and your company by unnecessarily spending company dollars and not being judicious and with how you spend that money. And so I think that's typically, me as having a sales team, I've made sure my sales team knows for sure if I see $100 meal on there and it doesn't have a client involved or at least 2 or 3 other people, you're paying for it. Because that's the thing, is expense reports don't have to be paid out. You can get denied.
Yes.
And I've made it very clear that I'm fine. Like, I understand if you have to eat in the airport, it's going to be a little bit more expensive than it would have been if you didn't.
Right.
But be reasonable.
Yeah.
It's like whenever your parents take you out for dinner back when you were in college, you're like, oh man, I can get the steak. You don't necessarily need to get the steak. Eat how you would usually. I mean, for what it's worth, if you're used to eating a steak, you're not going to care if I make you pay for it. So
yeah. As an HR person, I used to get complaints every now and then from VPs that would submit expense reports with, I don't know, $500, $700 bottle of wine or something on there to entertain clients. I'm like, what do you want me to do about that?
Right. Well, and in the sales world, like if you can justify the client with a large enough spend, $500, $700 bottle of wine, if they're going to spend $1 million, it's fine by me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But you've got to make the business case for it. And I think when it comes to a lot of monetary things, it really comes down to discretion. And I would encourage, especially students that are starting out or earlier in their career, I would advise them to spend less than more. When in doubt, don't get it.
Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Until you've really learned kind of where the line is, and you may be asked the question after you come back, like, hey, I was going to do this, but I didn't know, and your boss says, oh, that'd have been fine. Then Right. But it's a lot easier to ask when you did the right thing and find out that it would have been the wrong thing than do the wrong thing and try and have to ask for forgiveness. And you don't always get forgiveness in those cases. Companies, especially these days, I mean, a lot of companies are coming off some hard times over the last year.
Absolutely true.
You being frivolous with their spending isn't usually going to get you in good light.
No, you're right about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then you go also into expense reports themselves. There's a lot of things that you might justify in your mind, but I really don't think it's as gray as most people make it out to be.
Okay.
They just wish it were.
Right.
And I do think it goes back to, if you don't need something and you can't make the business case as to why you shouldn't have to pay for this yourself, then just be honest with yourself.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know, I've had a lot of conversations where, for instance, my company, I have an office in Hiawatha, but I work from home and have for even probably the year before COVID started, you know,
Oh,
just
wow.
because there's no reason for me to be in the office every day.
Sure.
And I wanted a standing desk. Well, I have a standing desk at my office. And they're like, you can take that if you want. And I'm like, I really don't want to. Those things are pretty heavy and kind of a pain to move. And I want it for when I do come in.
Right.
And so I talked to my HR guy and I just ended up buying it myself. Like, it was something I needed and I wanted, but I was also the one choosing to work from home.
Absolutely.
So I was making the choice, not them. You know, and then you also come on expense reports, you come down to mileage. Mileage is where a lot of salespeople get in trouble. You know, and also a lot of companies get in trouble because they
Yeah.
don't have it clearly defined. You know, so I've had a couple lengthy discussions with my HR guy about what my mileage should look like, because currently my boss pretty much wants me to fly out of wherever the cheapest airport in Iowa is.
Okay.
And so oftentimes that's Moline or Des Moines or Cedar Rapids. And they take the stance of whatever the mileage is from our home office, not from where I live.
Oh, yeah,
And
that's a significant difference.
it is. Well, and you know, I get their point because I choose to live an hour away from the office. You know, but on my point, I'm like, you knew I lived an hour away from the office and you're not even letting me fly out of the most convenient airport.
Right. Yeah.
And so, you know, it's ethical areas a lot of times do come down to gray areas. And unfortunately for you as an employee, it's whatever gray area the company decides is black, like black and white. I mean, they decide. You don't
Yeah.
really get to decide. And unless you're higher up in the food chain, you really don't get a say in it either. You just kind of have to accept it, but you have to know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't have the conversations, but when it comes to expense reports and money, not really a good idea to push the envelope as far as actions. Feel free to have the conversations, but at the end of the day, expense reports is what gets people really in hot water, which kind of leads into my third kind of area that I've seen. And I think this isn't just in sales. You know, for instance, what if I wanted to go print something off at work that wasn't work related? You know, because I don't have a printer at home.
Sure.
You'd think technically like printing 5 or 6 pages off isn't a big deal, right?
Wouldn't be a big deal. Right.
And it's not, except for the fact that technically you're stealing from the company.
Right.
And this is where it really comes down to A, who's watching it? B, how's your standing in the company? And C, you know, is it worth it?
Right.
You know, when I was at VGM, I went to my boss because I didn't have a computer at home and I was in the MBA program. I was like, hey, would you mind if I printed some of this out? You know, I'll be happy to give you $3 for the paper or whatever.
Yeah.
And he said, no, it's not a problem. But I have heard of places that can people for that. But oftentimes that was where people were looking for a reason to get rid of someone.
Right. Right.
You know, you're not going to get rid of your star performer for printing out,
No.
even if they took a whole ream of paper. Like, you can't take a whole ream of paper home. That's blatantly stealing.
Right.
But, you know, I would say that office supplies aren't exactly, you know, free for the taking, especially if you're not using them for business purposes.
Exactly.
And I would always err on the side of asking the questions. Don't go for the ask for forgiveness versus permission, because at the end of the day, you're really kind of playing with fire.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And yeah, the office supplies, that's one where most people don't think twice about that. So,
right.
Unfortunately.
Well, and it's not usually an area that's a problem unless someone's looking for a reason to get rid of you.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
as you were talking about the expense report notion and the different flights because of where you live now, wanting them to fly out of an airport further away, it had me thinking about all the companies now that are trying to reduce people's pay if they live away from the office and there's a cheaper cost of living. That's a whole other ethical dilemma that we can talk about on there too. But yeah, my mind happened to wander towards that area as you were talking about the airline issue and being further from home now too.
Yeah, that's an interesting area where I would probably argue to that, if you're wanting to recruit the best people, you have to be willing to pay them a livable wage wherever they live. Like, you know, when you hire them that they live in X place, and if you haven't set the expectation that they're to move,
Right.
You can't penalize them for that.
No.
Now, if you set the expectation of this is what you'll make, take it or leave it, and they take it, that's a different story. But my counter to that, if I was hiring a salesperson and my company wanted to do that, I would tell them, realistically, it's not their fault that we have a heavy investment in this office building that they're not going to be at. That's not on them.
Even in a good recruiting market, yeah, I would advise companies not to do that. But now what was it, in the last 2 months, 8.3 million people have voluntarily quit their jobs, and it's so tough to find people. Yeah, you can't be doing things like this with burnout when it is and so on. So
it is certainly a buyer's market as far as the job market is concerned.
That's
100%.
an understatement. Yeah.
We actually have hired probably 2 or 3 people over the last probably 6 months for important position, not just entry level positions. Right. I have a sales guy under me that lives in New York. And that's not cheap. Now I have to tell him, like, look, this is what you're going to make. But the interesting thing about that is our company has to pay taxes, and New York is one of the highest taxed states in the country.
Yep.
And so, but we still have to pay to be able to have a certain, like, you have to pay like an entry level. I don't quite understand it. You probably understand it better than I do, but you have to pay a certain level of state tax to have employees from that state. Now, it doesn't change with the number of employees. It's just your first one costs, and then you might as well open the market to New York people after that.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember how all that works. It's been a while now since I left the HR arena and started the 5 years of PhD program, hell, and then 11th year now at UNI. So yeah, it's been a while since I've had get involved on that side of it. But yeah.
The other area I would talk about from a sales perspective is commission.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of places have really defined territories. And so, I mean, you sell within your territory, but there's a lot of places that there's room for overlap in territories, or I know somebody
that couldn't possibly cause issues, could it? Not at all.
Well, and under my team, if that starts to happen, one of my first bosses at VGM had worked in a different division of VGM where they actually set up the commission structure where 25% of the commission came to whoever found it.
Okay.
And then 50% came to whoever's territory it was in. Or sorry, 25% to whoever's territory is in, and 50% to whoever closed it.
Okay.
And so it encouraged collaboration, because at the end of the day, and this is where salespeople need to sometimes get their head on straight. Like, while yes, they're hitting their goal and they're hitting their own wallet and money, if the sales as a team doesn't succeed, they won't succeed either.
Okay, good.
And I'm big on collaboration, and as I build out my teams, I want my teams to say, hey, I can help you with this. Like, I think I could probably help close this for the company. And I want them just to do it because it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
Not because, oh, I might spend some time and get money. I mean, if you create a culture and a sales team where, and this is not only culture, but this is also from the compensation standpoint. If you're incenting the right behaviors, you should be incenting people to help each other.
Good.
And so you can set up those structures, much like my first boss at VGM did in his former division, where helping each other, like, you might get a piece of the pie, but you're not going to get the whole pie, and it's not incenting that person to take the deal for themselves either. So if you incent that kind of sales shark kind of behavior, you're going to get sales shark kind of behavior, because inherently salespeople, 90% of them are majority driven by money. And to some extent that's a good thing, but it can also be a double-edged sword.
Sure.
And when people are driven by money, they tend to overlook ethical things that aren't gray. They just overlooked it because of the money.
Yeah. I'm always so glad that the sales classes, the sales center and things are going so strong. I teach negotiations.
Yep.
And there's a lot of students that get to where they hate it in the beginning, right? Because they think, I've never done this before. I could never do this. I can't sell myself, blah, blah, blah. So they'll go through the class, they'll get better at it, they'll start to enjoy it, and they'll come into me then to talk about career advice. And so immediately I think, well, what about sales? You seem to really like negotiations now. No, I can't sell. That's not good. I'm like, but you like my class. You like negotiating. We're buying and selling in there on a regular basis. And for whatever reason, they don't seem to comprehend that negotiations and sales are pretty much going hand in hand here as far as this context.
Really are.
And it always just blows my mind why, if you like this class so much and you're doing that well, why wouldn't you at least be open-minded towards considering that as a career path more?
100%. And, sales gets a bad rap. I mean,
Yes.
while sales can be a grind, and it's not a grind that
Sure.
everybody has the stomach for, honestly. It's what most sales jobs, once you get the ball rolling and you have that funnel kind of machine cranking out stuff at a good
Yeah.
rate, it
Yeah.
kind of has the snowball effect. So it's like losing weight. Like when you start to lose weight, it's hard work. It's a ton of hard work. But once you get to where you want to be and you're in kind of that maintenance mode, it's still hard work, but it's not as hard of work.
Right.
And sales is the one thing where no one's ever going to be able to look at you and say, I don't think you're doing anything. It's like, well, I hit my goal. So I think I am.
Absolutely.
And sales is a great job, for those that can stomach that grind, because you do have a lot of flexibility. I mean, you might be, working 60 hours a week for 2 or 3 weeks straight in a heavy period, but you also might have a pretty relaxed, couple weeks before and after that too.
Sure.
I mean, your activity is dictated by A, how much money do you want to make, and B, what are the deals in your cycle? Like, what does it demand? And it's, flexible to the point where, yeah, you might be doing some stuff on a Saturday night, but you also might be able to cut out at noon on Friday. Like,
Right. Yeah.
it comes with the territory. And I think that's the last area of the ethics that I think is probably important for students to know. And that's your time card. Like, I'm kind of the mindset that I don't pay you for 40 hours. I pay you for you hitting that goal.
Absolutely. Yes.
But there's a lot of people in the generation above us that would not agree with that.
Right.
And so you have to know who you're dealing with.
Yeah.
What is their philosophy? Because a lot of the more traditional leaders, they want 40 hours and you have to hit your goal.
Exactly.
And I do feel that a lot of those people are probably realizing that in order to have retention and all of that, they need to probably go more towards how I view it.
Yeah.
But if you have all that freedom and flexibility, like, that doesn't mean that you can be out making calls when you're supposed to be out making calls. You're sitting at home rewatching Monday Night Football.
Right.
And actually there was a guy many years, my predecessor at VGM, that was in sales, that got canned because he was supposed to be out doing stuff, and the head, whatever C-level person was in charge of Forbin at the time,
Okay.
drove by his house and saw his car was in his driveway.
Wow.
And then he drove by like 3 hours later and it was still there.
Yeah.
And when confronted about it, he completely lied about it.
Okay. Okay.
And so you never know who's watching. And so I always say, if you'd be uncomfortable with your boss knowing what you're doing, you probably shouldn't be doing it.
Absolutely. I think that's good advice. Yeah.
But especially when you're dealing with the more traditional people. I mean, I tell my sales team all the time, like, look, I don't care what you do. Like, keep me posted on what you're doing so I know if you're there or not. And I tell them, I trust you until you give me a reason not to.
Sure.
And about the time you give me a reason not to, that's going to mean I'm going to have to micromanage you, and I don't want to micromanage you. So that means you're probably going to be on your way.
Exactly.
Like, don't make me be that guy. I don't want to be that guy.
Right. Right. I think that's good. Most people don't prefer that as a leadership style. You're right.
None. Most people
There
don't
are
like
some
to be
people that
micromanaged.
don't want to have to think for themselves and want to be micromanaged, but it's a small minority. At least
I would agree. And I don't like to be micromanaged. I don't
Right.
want to micromanage you. I want to trust what you're doing. I want to help you grow and help you succeed, not have to be there cracking the whip to make sure you're doing your job.
Exactly.
Like, I flat out told him, if you start making me have to be that guy, we're probably heading for a split.
Yeah. Yeah. You're talking about the 40-hour work week. And even for a lot of companies, though, that's not even realistic anymore. I mean, 40, you're barely meeting their minimum expectations, I'm sure, at some places right now. But
Yeah,
that's unfortunate too. Hopefully we'll get back to a more normal expectation for workload from people too.
it is. But I also, when you talk about this pandemic and the work from home and all of that, I really think that, and we've had a lot of conversations, and I've pushed back on our leadership team at Channel Fusion on this as well.
Okay.
It is not on the employees to adapt to a culture that didn't adapt to remote work environment.
Nice. Very
Like, it is
true.
on
Very well
us.
said.
It is on us to adapt our culture, because my boss right now is freaking out because he's like, our culture is eroding. I was like, no, it's not eroding. It just needs to change.
Right.
We need to find ways to reach our culture through remote work. And that then falls on us as leaders of the team members to be able to do that. Yeah, that means I'm probably not walking by your desk, but I need to periodically just say, hey, what's up? Let's talk, and not have a work reason to do it.
Exactly.
That means I need to set what is productive and know and say, hey, here's how you prove to me you're being productive, and here's how we assess your productivity differently than I can visually see that you're in your seat.
Right. Right.
Like, it's just because you're in your seat doesn't mean you're being productive, and just because I can't see you doesn't mean you're not being productive.
Absolutely. That's very
And
well.
I think that's it goes back to that same traditional mindset of, you've really got to make sure that we are adapting to the times. And now that this is a buyer's market for employees, it is even more crucial than ever that we're finding ways to not only make people feel included that aren't physically there, we also have to find ways to build teams that aren't in physical proximity to each other, while also making sure that you can't lose company culture just because they're not there.
Right.
So that's on us, though. That's not on the employees to adapt to that. That's on us to adapt to the changing times.
I agree. I'd let you get on the soapbox about that all day long if you wanted to.
Love it. Love it. I'll do it all day.
All right. Well, Drew, thanks so much. This is great. I think the students will get a lot out of this, our colleagues, community members, whoever might be watching these. So thank you so much for taking time with me this morning.
Appreciate your time. Happy to help, Rusty.
Matt, thanks again.